thank you for being here tonight. We're glad that you are here. My name is Gina DuVernay, and I'm the Adult Services Manager for Gwinnett County Public Library. And my colleague Amy Perry is over there, who helps to put all this together. We also have Brave and Kind Books and they're located in Decatur. And they're here with copies of Denny Bryce's book, with also some other goodies. So please have a look there, and there are refreshments in the back, some nice warm tea, cookies, enjoy. So tonight we have Denny Bryce as our author for the evening, and Vanessa Riley is our moderator for tonight. So I'll be reading their bios and then kicking it over to Vanessa. Vanessa Riley is an award-winning author of such books as Island Queen and Queen of Exiles. Her works encompass historical fiction, romance, and mystery, and have been reviewed by the Washington Post, Entertainment Weekly, NPR, Publishers Weekly, and the New York Times. Riley was named the 2023 Georgia Author of the Year Awards literary fiction winner for Sister, Mother, Warrior. Denny S. Bryce is an award-winning and best-selling author of historical fiction, including Wild Women and the Blues. She is an adjunct professor in the MFA program at Drexel University, a book critic for NPR, and a member of the Historical Novel Society, Women's Fictions Writers Association, and Tall Poppy Writers. Bryce currently resides in Savannah, Georgia. So please help me welcome Denny Bryce. Thank you.
Well, it's been a journey to get here.
It's been stuff.
Yes. So Denny is a good friend of mine. In this author life, you need to do life with people. You need people in your corner. And Denny is that person for me. We run ideas together. And when I heard that there was an opportunity that people were looking for this story, this Victorian story about a princess, many people don't know you're an Anglophile.
Yeah, to a certain extent, yes.
She's traveled. So talk a little bit about your travels and then how that helped in writing this book about the other princess.
Well, I'll give you a little introduction to, I already did. I'm going to give you a little introduction to The Other Princess. The Other Princess, full title, a novel of Queen Victoria's goddaughter. And yep, there's the whole thing right there. And it came out 2 weeks ago, yesterday, because today's Wednesday. And a few years ago, because I had to look it up, 2021, I think I signed the contract in 2020. But there was a editor at William Morrow named Tessa Woodward who posted a tweet saying, how come no one's written a story about Sarah Forbes Bonetta? And of course I didn't pay any attention to it because it was biographical historical fiction. Has anyone here read any of my work before, like Wild Women and the Blues or, okay, so Wild Women in the Blues and my second book, In the Face of the Sun, are not about real people. They're definitely rooted in research and history and all that good stuff. But biographical historical fiction was this gal's thing. So I was sitting around just going, well, that's cool. And then the next thing I know is I get some information through the grapevine that William Morrow is looking for someone to write this book because no one had paid attention to the tweet that was sent out, or no one had responded, I think, in a timely fashion. So that's how this book began. I was drawn into the web of biographical fiction. Now I have 2 other books coming out that are biographical historical fiction, but that's a whole other story. And part of who I am as a writer, that this is my 3rd book, but I've always gravitated toward stories about coming of age, I don't know why, but all of my main characters very often are younger, in their 20s, except for this book where she starts from birth, is when the first opening is she's just been born. But I really enjoy diving into characters who have this monumental task of becoming adult, but not YA adult. No, I don't write YA. It's that coming of age from a certain place in their lives where they need to let go of some of the things that have kept them closed off from reality in a way. Okay, ask me a question.
Okay. So, one of the things that you actually stole a lot of questions in that answer, so I'll have to go backwards. But let's go back to storytelling. So once again, Wild Women in the Blues is a dual storyline. So it has somewhat of a present day storyline, a young man coming of age. It's got an old woman who you go back into her past, so to speak, and you see her journeys in the 1920s. This little book is very, very different.
Yeah.
You are cradle to almost grave, so to speak.
Cradle to the whole life.
So talk a little bit about the way you decided to write this story.
Oh, okay. What's interesting is my first draft of the story. Does anyone here know what we mean by dual timeline? A dual timeline for me, I had in Wild Women in the Blues, I'll use that as an example. The book took place in the present day at the time, 2013, and in 1920s, 1925 predominantly. So I'm writing a story that is connected, but just two different timelines. With this book, first draft had a dual timeline because that's sort of the bucket that I've been working in through my 3 stories. And my editor said, let's go with chronological. That sustains the suspense of what happens in her life, and it holds the story together. And it's really lovely to work with an editor who sees the big picture of a book. And that's what I felt happened in working with Tessa Woodward. And so I'm like, yay, because she was absolutely correct. That was the way the story needed to be told chronologically. And there are 2 chapters, the first chapter and a later chapter where I changed tense deliberately. The opening, I don't know if it's tense or POV. The opening is more what they call...
Omnipresent.
Yes, thanks. Say it again.
Omnipresent. So basically, omnipresent is where kind of God is looking down and telling the story. And as an origin story, as a birth story, you can't communicate. You're a baby. You don't have a language yet, except for wah. And we got to determine whether that's clean, whether that's food, et cetera. But that perspective, tell us about, why did you take us back to the birth? Why is that so important? You could have started anywhere else in her journey, but you took us back to her birth.
What was important about West Africa? What's important about the Nigerian? Back in the time period that this story takes place, there was no Nigeria per se. It's just West Africa. And Yoruba land was more so the terminology for that period. And there is a lot of importance placed on naming your children. The names have meaning. The names have a real distinct outlook for the child's future or their personality or their characteristics. So I will say that when she was born, she had her mother's umbilical cord wrapped around her neck. And in the Yoruba culture, that means that she's going to have a hard life. Her destiny is one of hardship. And so, not giving away too much for those of you who haven't read it, but the opening is her mother taking a moment to say, I don't want my daughter to grow up with this hardship? Why can't I name her something else besides Anya, A-I-N-A? And that's the reason I started there, because her life is about fighting against the hardships that come to her, but at the same time, overcoming those hardships and being a person that not only survives, but finds ways to thrive. And I wanted to tell that story, and I thought, and I truly believe that it was rooted in that name. And naming is a big deal in the story because we mentioned Sarah Forbes Bonetta. Sarah Forbes Bonetta was the name given to her by the missionaries after she was rescued. So her original name was Anya, or pronunciation is key, which means I just pull the book and I try to get the pronunciation, but the audiobook does a great job. She's really good. So I think that answers your question on that. Why did I start there? And I thought it was just it almost, I'm not a mystical writer. I'm an outliner, and I study and I research and I pull these things together when I'm working on books. But this gal's voice came to me in a very consistent way that surprised me. I could definitely hear her when I just started writing. And I do a funny thing because I will act out a scene and just dictate, because my past life I was an actress, a bad actress, but an actress nonetheless. I got a check once, so that meant that it was my job.
So I know oftentimes, like when I wrote Island Queen and even Sister Mother Warrior and Queen of Exile, people often remark that it's very rare to see an epic journey for a woman, particularly a woman of color. You start us in Africa, you take us on boats, then we get to London, and it's to the castle. Talk about what was important that you wanted to convey in this sweeping narrative.
One thing that was very exciting about my research, because research, and when you're doing biographical historical fiction or historical fiction period, is critical. Getting those facts together and just pulling them in a timeline or benchmarking the big moments, and then having this solid foundation for your creativity is what's really important. So in going and looking at her travels and her journeys, those were actual moments that were documented. I had letters that I could read where somebody in the Queen's royal household was saying, this is where she needs to be, and this is where she needs to go, and this is how much money we're going to pay for her clothing. There was literally accounting information about how much was spent. It's not all that detail is there, but it gave me such a good sense of how she was recognized within the household. The Queen said, pay for it, and everybody got to work and paid and made sure she had everything that she needed. But at the same time, what the Queen wanted for her was what she had to deal with, period. Whether she wanted it or not was secondary, but that was pretty much the royal household. The royalty, if you're a queen and you say this is what's going to happen to this, that, and the other person, that's exactly what happens. And just to add on, I have spent time in London, primarily in England, and visited Windsor Castle and a lot of other places there. I have not been to West Africa, and right now a friend of ours is traveling through Africa and talking about it on social media, Victoria Murray Christopher Murray. Okay, she's written The First Ladies. Is anybody familiar with that historical fiction book? Her and Marie Benedict. They also wrote The Personal Librarian. But right now, Victoria's in Africa, so I'm very jealous because I'm going to go. I'm going to go next year after I go to London and Greece and a few other places. Hopefully. Fingers crossed. Oh, turn the thing off.
So let's dig in. The title of this book is Goddaughter. So let's talk about the relationship between Anya or Sarah and Queen Victoria. What was the first meeting? What was that characterization?
Yeah, the first meeting was in January or November of 1840 something. I think it was 44 or 45. And Queen Victoria, for those who aren't into the Queen gal stuff, but she wrote diaries like millions of words, and you can go and pull them up any place you want. I didn't go through every moment of it because it's too much. But the interactions with Sarah were scheduled. They were scheduled events. It wasn't like, oh, I'm going to see the Queen today. No, 3 months out, you will see the Queen for this amount of time on this afternoon, and you will do this, that, and the other during this time. Well, Anya, or Sarah, would, the first thing she impressed the Queen, because during her trip from Africa, her first voyage takes a couple of months, 3 months, and because they were stopping along the way. It doesn't really take that long if they were going straight, but they were on the little ship and doing their thing. She learned English. And so the first meeting, she could speak English, and that impressed the Queen. And the Queen was like, wow, you're smart, and you're dark. And she does say, you're dark, but you're smart. So I'm going to want to see you again. And being a smart little girl, she went and said, she paid attention to what was going on around her, and she was like, well, the Queen likes music. The Queen likes singing. So she learned to sing. She learned to play the piano. She was proficient at it. She also had a natural talent for languages. So she worked with various ministers, British church at the time, and translated the Bible into the different Yoruba languages. So, and she started doing this at 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. She was just very talented in that area. And she really paid attention to what impressed the Queen. And every time she went back, she was showing the Queen her talent, what she'd learned. And she was very good at it. Oh.
And that's one of the things I loved about this book, because, there are naysayers in the world, we run into them, who want to diminish the relationship that this woman had with the Queen. They want to make her a novelty, like she's just a gift. I've heard that so many lines. She was gifted from the Yoruba king to the Queen. Yeah. You run into a lot of issues sometimes when you're telling these stories. I want to know a little bit about your approach. The Queen definitely called her dark. Some might want to, try and rewrite history and absolve colorism issues or absolve racism issues, particularly are centered around royalty. You hit it straight on. So talk a little bit about your approach.
Well, I take a similar approach to all of my books, and that is, my story is king or queen. The character is the soul of the book. The circumstances, the lifestyle, the customs, the racism, the prejudices, all of those things that are a part of that era, that are entrenched in that time period, I don't ignore. But just like Americans today, you do what you need to do to become the person you want to be. And At least that's what I believe many people should be doing, as opposed to hiding from the conflicts of prejudice, segregation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in the 1850s, for example, this is not a big spoiler, but in England, they believed that Africans could not deal with cold weather. It would kill them being in cold weather. And it's just because they were African and they were used to the heat. So they had a whole thing about that. And you're like, okay, but that's a reality of that time period. So you can't take away, when you're writing historical fiction, the facts that were the customs. I mean, women had no agency. Black women, less agency. Even if you were a part of the royal household, your options for financial gain were, non-existent if you were going to be a good person and not work the streets. The streetwalkers could make money. But other than that, there was very little you could do. Now, a domestic or someone who was working in the kitchen or a cook, but that's a different caste system. I'm talking about the royal household and those people who were educated and pristine and hung out with the queen and did all of that sort of stuff. So yes, I did not ever ignore those issues, but rolled them into this young woman who wanted certain things to happen in her life, and certain things she just ignored. She was a princess when she was in Africa in her village. And I did not take away the idea that once you're a princess in your mind, you're always a princess. And that was a thread that I kept going toward in this story, or kept alive in the story. And that caused her conflict, because her version of a princess and Queen Victoria's version of a princess were two different things.
And I love that you didn't actually stray from conflict between this relationship. You have Anya, who's, her life is dependent upon the queen's favor, doing what the queen wants. You've got her learning the piano and songs. But there is a moment that I love, hopefully we're going to like a little spoiler, because I love getting just a teeny little spoiler. But there was a great conflict.
Yeah.
That Anya, for a moment in time, put her foot down. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, that was, there's a moment, I am not going to spoil it completely, but there's a moment in her life where she makes a choice to end defiance of the queen. And she holds that position for quite some time at a great deal of risk to herself. But she's someone who believed that her life should have agency and that she should have choices. There's even a scene, I don't know if it's still in the book or not, because this happens when you write a lot of books. It's like, I wonder if I kept that in there, where she and Princess Alice debate, because Princess Alice, what Queen Victoria did was she told her daughters and sons, here's who you're going to marry. And strategic marriages, very strategic marriages, so that the power base that, frankly, you study what was happening in the late 19th century, you'll have a very good idea of the path that led to World War I. From her choices, how she put those marriages together. So Anya and Princess Alice definitely had again, I can't remember if I kept it in. They had conflicts. It's in there? Okay, good. And then one other conflict they had, that was Mary Seacole, who was a Jamaican woman who was known as a nurse and caregiver during the Crimean War, around the time that Florence Nightingale was heralded as the one who took care of everything well. The British soldiers loved Mary Seacole. They raised money, they did events and all sorts of stuff. And I have a scene in the story where there's conflict between Princess Alice and Sarah because Queen Victoria would not allow Mary Seacole into the castle. She didn't invite her to any events, she didn't do anything with her. But, you know, everything was all about Florence Nightingale, and Sarah had read Mary Seacole's book. So she's like, I don't know why, you know, she can't be a part of, she can't come to this event. And they ended up doing a lot of stuff anyway. But I don't want to give too much away because as the story comes back to me, I'm like, oh yeah, that's what happened then and that's what happened there. Oh, yeah.
You know, I once again, as an author in historical fiction, you read your buddy's books, you read your peers' book because you want to see the choices that they make. Yeah, yeah. And I think the way that Denny lays this story out is so fascinating. But now let's talk about my special favorites. Okay. Because I do love stories. And you have two in this book. Mr. Freddie. Freddie. And Mr. Davies.
Yeah.
Could you compare and contrast?
Yeah. Well, how can I talk about, again, spoilers. There are some facts from my research that led me to make a decision about the possibility of a love affair between another character and Sarah. And they went to London one weekend, and she had, and this is documented in some letters where she has to send a letter back to the family saying, we've run out of money and we're gonna have to spend the weekend until you send us some money in London. And then a couple of weeks later, she ends up having a problem with the Queen about this. But I'm going to talk about my research for a minute because I found some fascinating ways. People talk about Ancestry.com, and I've just been playing around in that for years. It's just fun. But they also keep track of the census, and I have the international one because my family's Jamaican and Bermudan on my dad's side and Jamaican on my mother's side. And the Jamaicans, well, both families are, I sort of, after my parents, everything falls apart in terms of history. I have to go international because they were in England, they were here, there, and everywhere. So I was looking for a census information and found Sarah's in a census book with Freddie and the entire household that she lived in, the Scone family, S-C-H-O-E-N, I think, I can't remember. And the whole neighborhood is a part of that. So I was able to piece together the time they spent together, plus there are letters that he doesn't have that many, but I do know he was supposed to be a minister and he never became a minister. I don't know why, but I made it up.
Okay, before we get back to Mr. Davies, I do want to, you know, when you're piecing together African American Black history, you sometimes run into gaps. And just talk a little bit about the letters, because that is such a benefit, because women in general don't leave diaries behind, men do. You know, we're very lucky to have Anne Frank's diary. But you actually have the letters, because sometimes those are destroyed. So if you could talk a little bit about the letters, even the how they were found, because I thought that was fascinating.
Well, I am not the finder of these letters. These letters were found in the late 1990s at a London bookshop, buried under a bunch of stuff, and the London bookshop owner reached out to a friend of his, an African-American children's book writer named Walter Dean Myers. I think that's his last name. And Walter wrote a book called At Her Majesty's Request, and that book became a key source for a lot of my background information, because what he did was pull many of those letters and put them in this children's book that he wrote. That's amazing. It's all about Sarah. And he just, I think he was originally from Detroit, and he just, boom, as soon as he got that phone call from that London bookshop, he was on his way to London. In addition to that resource, there was a man in the early 2000s who was a doctor, but he was a history geek, and he wrote this rambling historical book about a man named Captain Davies. I can't say all of his name right now, but Captain Davies was a wealthy, unbelievably wealthy African merchant. He was also a British seaman. He was the right kind of guy that the Queen had had a long history with through the bishops and the ministers. And I didn't even dive into how strategic everything Queen Victoria did, because it wasn't her book. It was Sarah's book. But there's so much maneuvering and manipulation of people that the total thing that they wanted to accomplish, the British wanted to accomplish during this time period, was the saving, and I'll put that in quote, of the Africans. The only way to save them was to make them Christians, because otherwise they were heathens and savages. And that's one of the other reasons they changed their names to religious names or Christian names or whatever, because Sarah means princess. So that was an interesting accidental naming, or maybe it was deliberate. I made it deliberate in my book. So, yeah.
Okay. All right. You keep skipping James Pinson Lobolo Davies.
I
Talk
do.
about him, and if you could give us who did you imagine, if this was a movie, who would be playing him?
Yeah, because that's what I do. I do vision boards on characters. And I'll tell you, and this may sound really crazy and wacky, but I'm going to share it. One of the things that I felt like he was Rhett Butler in a way, from Gone with the Wind. I'm sorry, I did. He's just...
Ain't nothing wrong with that.
There's nothing wrong with Rhett. And he was just wealthy and would do whatever he had to do for his brides. And because there are plurals, and there are complexities to his life that are amazing. But I don't want to say too much about him, but he was credited later in his life with being the man who brought cocoa to what is now Nigeria. I mean, he would just give tons of money, and he did. He was a seaman, he was a British naval officer, he was from Freetown, and so his family were enslaved and came to Freetown, and I think the name of that group is called SARO, S-A-R-O, and it's a group of Africans who have gained their freedom during this time period. We're talking 1800s, around that time, because in 1834 is when the Brits, canceled slavery.
In their colonies, yes.
In the colonies and throughout Africa as well. But what they didn't do was if someone already owned slaves and was in the slavery business, they did not stop them. They just said, try not to do it. that was the extent of their stopping it. I mean, there's so much that I've discovered, because I'm a history geek, and diving into this time period, Vanessa knows this, I had sworn a couple of years ago that I would never reach back further than 1900 because I needed a telegram, somebody had to have a phone. I couldn't go back into that weird place where they were waiting for mail and all sorts of crazy stuff. So, but then I got into it, and I'm gonna pitch a story that's gonna go back to that. Oh, shush.
And I laughed at her.
Yeah, she laughed.
I laughed
but
so
you know
hard.
what? She got some 1990s coming in the
I know,
books.
that was hard. That
She was
so
suffering.
hard. That was so hard. You contemporary people are like, oh, that's, anyway.
Okay.
Okay, we hold on.
No,
Okay.
It's on you.
Okay, so once again, this book takes from the inception to the ending. You have a woman on a journey. What are the themes you were most, that you really wanted the audience to take away from her life? Because every author has a thought, especially as you're getting into, you're hearing her voice as you're writing. What is it that or was she telling you of her story that you wanted, that you wanted to be in that book? That's, that had to be in there.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I'm hesitant to nail what that one thing was. I know that what struck me about her, that I wanted to make sure I got on the page, is that stubbornness can be a good thing. If your stubbornness is really a part of who you are, and it has a foundation. She had a foundation of, I am not going to be treated this way. And what I'm finding in some of the feedback, because I actually read Goodreads reviews, and I do. I'm going there, and they've been excellent. They've been absolutely. I'm very excited about the feedback on Goodreads. It's doing really well. But one of the comments that I found, not one, it appears more than once, is a discussion of, well, why was she was given all of these things, hanging out with the queen, living the life of luxury. She was privileged. How come she was so selfish? And I was like, that's an interesting perspective to me, because I never saw her as selfish. I never saw her as privileged. She was surviving. And I thought that was the story I wanted the reader to really connect with. But readers, I'm a firm believer that once I write a book, I let it go, because it's the reader's book. And their takeaway from characters is absolutely their right as a reader, because I know I do it in books that I read and book reviews that I write. That's my thing. That's my moment of connection with story as a reader. So I never debate that, except if they give me too many one-star reviews, and then it's a whole different thing. There's me cursing in the corner with some tequila,
But there are not that many. If they are, they're insane, because this book is absolutely wonderful. Denny, as we're wrapping up,
Okay.
What are you working on next?
Oh, gosh almighty. Okay, so I've been busy. My first debut novel was Wild Women in the Blues, and that book has been my bestseller, but The Other Princess is coming in on it, and then there was In the Face of the Sun was the second. My fourth book is entitled Can't We Be Friends? It's the story of Ella Fitzgerald and Marilyn Monroe's friendship, and I'm writing that it's written. It's coming out March 5th, and with Eliza Knight, who is the author of many fabulous books, but her most recent one is called Starring Adele Astaire. It's the story of Fred Astaire's sister. And so we have that book, March 5th, and she and I started working on that book in 2019. One of the most joyful bits of research for that book was listening to all of Ella Fitzgerald's songs. And especially her live concerts or performances, because that's where her personality, very private woman, very hard to find something. Even in the biographies, there's a new biography coming out next month that hopefully will be much more detailed about the woman versus what I've went through that was mostly about her music. But very excited about, these gals were friends. They had a lot of connections, and I think we've taken, Ella's story has never been fictionalized, but Marilyn, of course, has been out there, but I think we've brought a fresh story to the table. The book after that, I have 2 books coming out next year, is called The Trial of Mrs. Rhinelander. I was explaining it earlier yes, we were talking about it, Gina. This is a story set in 1925, New York City, and a couple had been dating for 3 years. The man was a very, very wealthy white man who was, think Rockefellers, except his name was Rhinelander. And he was dating a domestic, a poor girl. And they had a rollicking love story happening. And then they got married. And 2 weeks after they got married, he sued her for an annulment on the grounds that she never mentioned she was colored. And that became one of the biggest stories nationwide in 1925. And so, that book is coming out in July of 2024. And then another book after that in 25 is called Where the False Gods Dwell. And it features, I haven't really mapped it out completely yet, features Katherine Dunham. Is anyone familiar with Katherine Dunham? She's not the star of the book, but her work, she was an anthropologist. And part of what she did in 1935 was travel to Jamaica and Haiti to do research on dance. And it really impacted her choreography and her work with different dancers. But my story is a psychological thriller about a serial killer. Yeah, I just twisted it up. It's historical fiction, I swear. It is, 1935. So that's what I'm doing. And I'm very excited, and there'll be more stuff coming too. We're busy bees. She's prolific. I'm trying to keep up, but she's mentioned her other books. I can't mention all of her books because there's 75,000 of them, but her historical fictions have been am I still talking? She mentioned them, I'm gonna say them again. Her first one was called Island Queen. Her second one was called Sister Mother Warrior. And her third one is Queen of Exiles. And the fourth one is going to blow people's minds.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I can't say anything about it because
we're but that's how you remember I told you as we started, you have to have an author friend that you can just like, girl, is this crazy? Is this crazy? So that'll become my next historical fiction. We're going to take a break for a year because I've been banging them out for you guys. It'll be coming out in 25, but it'll be my first dual storyline, 1990s and 1675. Just say pirates, anybody?
Yeah.
Okay. But next week, the second book in the Lady Birthing series, Murder in Drury Lane, No Good Deed Goes Unpunished, comes out on Tuesday. So I'm very, very excited about that.
It's coming. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
This month has gone really fast.
It's flying.
This
it's
year
flying.
has gone really fast, for that matter. It's messed up. But did you have any questions?
I was just going to say we have time.
Yeah.
Would you mind just like taking
I just wondered if the book that you were talking about with Ella and Adele, when they do it on audio, are they going to put some music with it? Some of Ella's music?
I would say probably not because of licensing. We got to be very careful with music in this, especially someone who has a huge foundation behind them. In fact, you're hitting a great time because today I received an email while I was driving here from Savannah with a list of possible narrators for the audiobook. I think if they might do a musical intro. Just every chapter is either named after a song or a movie. So we do try to infuse it as much as possible, but boy, oh boy, you have to be so careful with music.
But you will be doing a playlist for readers.
Oh yeah, I'll do a playlist. I'll do a playlist, but especially as it connects to the story we're telling and the time period. And there's some surprises in there. Yes, there
I
are.
thought some of that might be old enough to be beyond the public domain.
I wish, but the cutoff is 1924. And then you have to be very careful with it. In fact, I also use newspaper clippings, and we had to pull a lot of those because I used a lot of Jet magazine, TMZ of its day, and a lot of, there was some Ebony, but a strong source for her was actually New Amsterdam News. The black newspapers nationwide had a lot of. I was looking for the other side of the story. So I wish that was possible.
Hi, Miss Amy. Thank you for being here. This was a
Thank
great
you.
talk. And I already started the book, and it's a page turner, so please get your copies. I have two questions, if that's okay. My first question is, because you mentioned that you were not going to do anything before 1900, but obviously that's not what happened.
Yeah.
But do you decide time period or location? I was very intrigued that you chose your land, because I'm an Africana historian as well, so I love what you're doing. But I'm wondering, like, how do you choose location, or do you choose time frame, or how do you go about that?
Well, with this book, The Other Princess, the time frame and locations were given to me in documentation of research. So all of the locations have definitely a part of her story, of her life. Another book that I'm working or planning to pitch, it's a little different. I picked location, and just to give you, hopefully this book will come to pass. There's a house on Charles Street in London, and that house was going, in my head, it's going to be occupied by 3 women, but the one in present day who's a student at the Royal College of Art, this young lady right here, is going to help me develop this character because she's an artist of her generation. And then the other 2 were inspired by 1966 and 1866. 1866, a woman named Fanny Eaton is anybody familiar with the Pre-Raphaelite artists? They were huge in England at that time, and they were daring and whatever. And they used a black Jamaican model that was ignored for almost 100 years as being a part of their model crew, because they had a whole crew. And then in 1966, the first black model to appear on the cover of Vogue magazine was a woman named Danielle Luna. And actually there's a HBO, I touched the thing, HBO special, I think, called Barefoot on the Moon. That should be, it's a documentary. But anyway, so I'm piecing together stuff, but location became important, more so than time.
Thank you so much for that. And my second question to you, because I'm a nerd, I wanted to know what are some of your favorite archives, whether online or in person, that you use for your research?
I will say that JSTOR, but I was going to mention Library of Congress.
Yes.
Vanessa and I traveled, and you were there too, yay! We went to the map room at the Library of Congress. Oh my God, so much fun. I know, sad. It was, it's like we had a party. We were there for like 5 or 6 hours. It was just heaven.
Sit in break for coffee.
Right? Go get us some. We're not leaving this place. Library of Congress, actually online is very helpful because they have something called Ask a Librarian, and they will get back to you with information. If they don't have it, they will give you direction on how to get it. JSTOR, most definitely, is great. As a professor at a university, I have access to the library system and the research dissertations are wonderful resources. Medical information, because I'm also working on a story that has medical stuff in 1930s, different from other years. Oh, I'm trying to think. Oh, of course, newspaper archives. British newspaper archives are excellent, but in general, for me, since my characters and the history that I focus on is predominantly African American or Black, as in Africa or whatever, the Black newspapers are amazing resources. They've been around forever. Chicago Defender, New Amsterdam News, just to name a couple. Pittsburgh Gazette, am I right with that? Philadelphia Inquirer, goes on and on.
One of the things I was shocked at was, I don't have it anymore, was that the first the first Black newspaper reporter is in the United States, and London didn't get it until like the later part of the 1900s. Mm-hmm. I blew my mind.
And there's also something that called the Associated Negro Press, similar to AP, Associated Press, that was, huge in terms of international news coverage. And that includes people like Langston Hughes, who was a correspondent, a war correspondent during a portion of his life. Yeah, I know I stumbled into that, and so that's another book idea.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Anyone else? Comments, questions?
I'm only on chapter 6,
Okay.
but it broke my heart that it was the Ogoji tribe that captured her after seeing the Weir with Viola Davis. I'm
Yep.
like,
Yeah.
oh no, it's so sad. But I know that's Norm, but it just broke my heart that it was that tribe that captured her.
But that's Three Chiefs Up, and that boy crazy.
No, it's the same one.
No, Three Chiefs Up, from when Viola's time frame.
It's the same guy.
It's the same guy?
Schizo.
It's Schizo? Oh,
It's
never
Schizo.
mind, never mind.
There's a different interpretation of history. Another resource I had was the journals of Lieutenant Commander Frederick Forbes, who is the British naval officer who rescued Enya and took her back to London. In his journals, he details, and you can download this online, History Buffy people, and he discusses and has artwork. Somebody did etchings of Gizo's camp, where part of his rituals was the beheading of slaves to show his wealth to other people. So it's story. The Ogoji in The Woman King is a different story entree, but the Ogoji were warriors, and they fought, and if Gizo said, take this town and kill everybody except X, Y, and Z. That's what they did. And he was a slaver. So
We're a fan of telling all the history.
yeah.
We don't sanitize it. We tell all the history, but we try and give enough context so you will understand the world. So even though Giza, I personally think he was crazy, the Homie Kingdom has conflict on all sides. Everybody wants that land, and so he would do aggressive taking over other nations. And if he took over other nations, he knew that the minute they had a chance, they would just revolt or rebel. So he would sell the men off, or decorate the tops of his palace with the heads as showing his power. If you were a woman, they potentially could sell you off. If you was cute, you might make it to be a wife number 2, which would be a Minos or the Agogi, or you might be a top tier wife, the ones that he loved and had children with. So, but they typically, you were threats. So he's looking from that perspective. Not saying it's right, but that's a perspective of that.
Yeah, of that time period, of that kingdom.
You mentioned interpretation, which is one of my favorite things about history. But my experience with interpretation is more within a truth, right, versus having the fiction part.
Right.
Are there any rules that you lean into when you are deciding how and what to interpret because you're doing it from a fictitious perspective?
I have some rules. I think all writers do, but there are some universal rules. If somebody is dead at a certain date, it's hard to resurrect them. Even in fiction, you got to be careful with that. I also don't make a villain out of someone who might have been, I'm not going to take someone who was doing what they were supposed to do. Like, I don't make the missionaries in my story villains. Personally, colonialism is villainous, but I'm not going to do that. They were doing what they felt was right. So I go back to character and say, what is the impact on character of their choices? But I can't change attitudes, or I can't change history or cultural, societies' feelings and expressions during that time period, because it's sort of like all of a sudden, you don't have the lynchings that took place across the country, and you say, oh, well, maybe that wasn't that way. But history is history, so you can't do too much. So that's a big rule. If World War II lasted from this day to that day, the big things, big events, I don't mess with. And I, in Wild Women in the Blues, I had Oscar Michaud, for example. And and Oscar Michaud, he had some shady sides to him, but I put him on the page as a fun guy. Someone, actually, I used...
Stephen.
No, not Step, that was the second book, but Perry. What's his first?
Lincoln Perry. No, that's second book.
No, the Perry of today. What's the mogul?
Oh, Tyler Perry.
Tyler Perry. I used Tyler Perry in my mind as Oscar Michaud because I remember Tyler Perry. I lived in Chicago for a long time, and Tyler Perry started at some of the theaters there, putting on Sunday afternoon theater, where. Okay, I was in the audience with the rest of the people who went to the church. The whole thing in Chicago at that time was just crazy. But nonetheless, you take what you can. He wasn't a bad guy. It wasn't his book, but I wanted him on the page as an interesting person for my main character to interact with. So,
And that's, I mean, you know, you try not to do harm. And one of the harmful things is injecting 21st century values into people who lived in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. That's a no-no. And people were logical. They would do, for the most part, logical things. So even if they do something that I personally disagree with, I will give you enough context so that you will see why they're making their decision. Because people are logical. There's reasons why they do X, Y, and Z. And if it's just total blind hate or total love, you've reduced this person to a one-dimensional character. It does no service to that. Layered characters are the ones we keep talking about. It's the ones that you think about, and you look at their actions and you look at your life and you have that conversation. So you have to give enough character complexity so that it makes sense to why they're doing the things they're doing in the book.
right.
Whether you agree with it or not, but giving enough context.
As a writer, definitely, whether you agree or not, because otherwise you have, as you pointed out, a book that's not balanced in terms of storytelling.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Wow, thank you so much. I don't know if you all can hear me, because I can hear me. But thank you. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Very interesting. Denny, if anybody would like their book signed, Denny will be at this table. She's happy to sign that, sign your copy. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming.